In our last video, we looked at this building, which used to be the old Port Huron Library, and is now the Port Huron Museum. Before we move on to the museum, I found this photograph since my last video that shows the inside of the building when it was the Port Huron Library. And I thought this was kind of cool because you can see the books there. They're not jammed in to libraries like they are today, but there was a lot of extra space there. And of course, the beautiful columns there. And then right to your left, you see the checkout counter. Notice the lady on the right reading with a large hat on. All right, now we can move on to the museum. I've never been in this building since it's been a museum. I tried one time, and I picked the one day that the museum was closed, I guess. And of course, I went right up these front steps, and of course, the door was locked, and I realized this wasn't the entrance. Then I went around the back and found out there was a different entrance. Well, you could have knocked me over with a feather when I saw this. Look at the difference in the architecture between the original building and the new addition. I didn't even realize that new addition was there, I guess. Like I say, it's been years since I've been in this building. It's a pretty impressive entrance, though. But of course, this entrance was locked too because they were not open that day. I was happy to see that they recognized the contribution that Andrew Carnegie made to this library by the signage that they have here. Port Huron Museum, Carnegie Center. Some people think that this is the only site for the museum, but actually there's several sites. This one right here, for example. The Huron Lightship Museum. As natives of Port Huron, we take this ship for granted, actually. We pass it many times, have seen it many times, but for somebody visiting the area, this would be a unique find, someplace that would be very interesting to visit and learn the history of the ship. The Huron Lightship was the last operating lightship on the Great Lakes and served for over 50 years. She was retired in 1970. But for 36 of those years, she was stationed just north of Port Huron, so that's why most of us are familiar with her. It's always fun to take a tour of this ship. Another museum site is the Fort Gratiot Lighthouse. Who wouldn't like the adventure of going up these stairs, and then going up the top and going out on the catwalk and looking at the beautiful view out there? The latest museum site is the Fort Gratiot Hospital, which is the only surviving building from Fort Gratiot. After Fort Gratiot closed, the hospital was divided into two separate buildings, actually two homes that were put on what is now St. Clair Street. In 2000 to 2002, the Port Huron Museum acquired both homes and moved them to a lot in Lighthouse Park that was owned by the city of Port Huron. They were aligned side by side in the stockade fence lot, awaiting the funds and opportunity, and with much volunteer help and the much needed funds came in, and of course that house was put back together to once again become the Fort Gratiot Hospital. I can't wait to see it. I thought you'd like to see what the original hospital looked like. We're very fortunate to have a photograph of the original hospital when it was located at the fort. So you see, the museum is more than just this building. This building, however, has had many wonderful nuggets of history over the past, whether it be paintings or sculpture, musical instruments of old, or perhaps you could see what a mansion of old in Port Huron used to look like on the inside. Maybe the building was torn down, but some of the things were saved and donated to the museum. Or perhaps your interest lies in the maritime history of Port Huron. This building has also housed many charitable events over the years. Oh, I love the architecture of this building. Look at those columns. And here's something you wouldn't expect to see in this museum: an automobile. How in the world would they get an automobile into this museum? Good question. Glad you asked. Here's the answer. Very carefully. Yes, there's something for everyone at this museum. Before we move on, there's two other things I want to share with you about this block, and this is the first one. First, we want to look at the house across the street from the library. And what's the historical significance of this house? Well, this is where my wife had an apartment before she was my wife and we were dating. You can see this same house in this photograph here that was taken many, many years ago. And that silly young man sitting on top of the car making faces is me. I think I was showing off for my girlfriend. I had fond memories of this area right in front of the museum. I remember once during an ice storm, Nancy and I were able to skate on the sidewalks and the street, going back and forth in front of the museum and her house. Another time we were sitting in front of the museum in the car. It was a cold day, we had the heater on, and of course the defrosters, and we were having an intelligent conversation when a police officer came up and rapped on the window because they were so fogged up he couldn't see. But I assured him that the defrosters were working fine, they just seemed to be overtaxed at the moment, and he went on his way. Well, Nancy and I eventually got married and lived happily ever after. And she's still my first mate, but every once in a while I let her wear the captain's hat just to make her feel good. The second thing we want to look at is something that's behind the museum. As we look from this aerial view here and zoom in, we can see that there's a cabin back there, and this is called the Kamer cabin. I assume it's Kamer, maybe it's Kamer, I'm not real sure, but one of them. In 1854, Conrad Kamer and his family settled in Casco Township to the southwest of Port Huron. These German immigrants came to build new lives for themselves on a quiet farm in the middle of the eastern Michigan wilderness. They cleared trees from their land and constructed a house of logs. Generations of Kamers lived in this house. Over the years, many additions and improvements were made to keep pace with the changing times and fashions. The original log walls with mud daubing had been completely hidden by two different layers of exterior siding. In June of 1981, the home was presented to the Port Huron Museum of Arts and History by Mr. Robert Nellis. As the picture you're looking at shows, it was in pretty rough shape by the time the museum got it. But through much work and diligent effort upon a part of a lot of different volunteers and donations, this cabin became a reality to be restored to what it looked like originally, or very similar. Today it's an attraction for school children and adults alike, where they can see during pioneer days what it used to be like in the days of old. But here's an actual photograph that shows what it was like in the days of old, because this is the Kamer family standing in front of this cabin. And you can see by this photo that there was an attachment to this cabin as well that didn't quite make it to the Port Huron Museum. There are other things in this block we'll look at when we get to the 7th Street video. But let's mosey on south down the street and see what there is to see here. On the east side of the street, there's not much to look at except the parking lot. But on the west side of the street, you can see the Grace Episcopal Church, which has quite a history. The church is over 100 years old, with a cornerstone being laid back in 1889. I've always admired the architecture of this church. I think it has some unique features. I especially like these turrets that are on the side of the church. The first religious society in Port Huron to form a legally incorporated association was the Protestant Episcopal Church, as it was known back then. It filed its papers with the county clerk February 3, 1840. Prior to this, the Reverend Charles Wrigley, who was a chaplain at Fort Gratiot, held services for Episcopal families and friends in Port Huron homes. Seats were also provided at the fort for those desiring to attend the services. They soon became ambitious for a church home of their own, and in October of 1840, they were presented with a lot that was donated to them on the northwest corner of Huron Avenue and Butler Street. Of course, this corner is better known to us as where Sperry's department store used to be, and as of recently, the Sperry's movie theater is now located. The missionary committee gave them $200, and with that in sight, they obtained enough subscriptions from their members and friends so that by August 8, 1841, they were able to dedicate their church building free from debt. This photograph, taken from the church's history archives, shows their first church. Of course, it doesn't really look like a church, it looks more like a home here. And I actually think it was a home when this picture was taken. Let me explain. This church was small, holding only 125 people, and as the church grew, it exceeded this number, and so they decided to build another church, which would be located on 6th Street. The first church was sold and moved across the street and converted into a home. It was located in about the middle of the block on the south side of Grand River, about where the Majestic Theater used to be. This map was produced in 1867, 13 years after the church was moved across the street and converted into a home. And it appears that home is still there, as designated by the arrow. On a side note, the fellow that ended up living in this home was Peter O'Neill. He was one of the O'Neill brothers from the O'Neill Brothers store that was located just around the corner in the 200 block of Huron Avenue. So he wouldn't have had far to walk to work. After selling their first church, this is the second church they built. This was known as the Little Brown Church because it was, well, painted brown. This was on 6th Street, but not where the present church is located. It was located in the block where the library is located. A lot on the southwest corner of Wall Street and 6th Street was donated to the church, and then for a nominal price, the two adjacent lots on Wall Street were also purchased by the church. And so the church was built on the corner lot, except it didn't face 6th Street, nor did it face Wall Street. It faced Court Street. I'm not sure why it didn't face 6th Street, but I'm pretty sure I know the reason why it didn't face Wall Street. In the book, The Story of Port Huron by Helen Endlich, she basically referred to Wall Street as a mud hole. She didn't use that word, she used the word swale, which basically means the same thing, or a quagmire. This is what she said. Wall Street was a swale between 6th and 7th Street, with a high wooden sidewalk with a railing along one side. The church was backed up against the swale and faced south, with the beautiful pine trees in front. We don't have to use our imagination to visualize this because we can look at this map that was made in 1867 and accurately describes Port Huron in a very picturesque way. And you can see the Grace Church on this corner. And you can see the pine trees that the artist put in just to let you know there were pine trees in front of the church. So I thought this was pretty interesting. On a side note, it was when Grace Church was located at this location that the Little Brown Church purchased the first organ in the city of Port Huron. I imagine that was a happy day for them. The history of the church recorded by Grace says this. In 1874, the subject of a new church was brought up, and as the location was found to be too near the Taylor School, a property with grounds enough for a church, chapel, and rectory all connected was thought to be very desirable. The land that was thought to be very desirable was the land that's designated by this red rectangle. This land was actually owned by the city. The Taylor School that they were concerned about, I believe, is this school right here. This is the only reference I've ever heard in any of the history I've read about the Taylor School on 6th Street. The city was willing to trade their 3 lots for the 3 lots that sat on Wall Street that was owned by the Grace Church. And so the Little Brown Church was moved across the street over to Court Street, facing 6th Street actually, and it got the facelift. It had new brick put on the outside of the brown siding, and it was also redecorated on the inside. This church was known in later years as the Chapel, and served as a Sunday school after the present church was built. It was taken down in 1914. About 15 years later, in 1889, the church membership had increased to a degree that steps were taken to build a modern new stone church. Plans were made for the new church and blueprints drawn up and subscriptions taken for the foundation. The chapel was moved once again, only this time to face Court Street. The church was finally completed in 1891. This photograph was taken shortly after the church was completed. You really can't tell from this postcard, but the windows in this church are quite unique. Take a look. The first window we want to look at is the stained glass window that's in front of the sanctuary. This is a beautiful window. You can't see it real clear here, so let's look at this next photograph. This is the same window. It's called the Transfiguration. And in this photograph here, we'll blow it up even more, and you can see the detail in it. Here's a couple more windows. All of these stained glass windows were given as a memorial to a loved one. These two windows are referred to as the Easter Lilies windows, and they're thought to be the oldest in the building, and have been attributed by church tradition to the Tiffany Studios of New York City. But perhaps the most impressive memorial that was given to the church is this structure right here. Mr. James Golden, who died in 1901, was for many years a vestryman of Grace Church. His widow, Mrs. Martha Golden, presented as a memorial of him the fine church house and beautiful chapel that you see in this photograph. The cornerstone was laid in July of 1909 and dedicated in April 1912. Most of us, of course, don't remember James Golden, but many of us remember the home that he lived in. It was this beautiful home that sat on the corner of Glenwood and Pine Grove Avenue that was torn down to be replaced by a gas station. It's difficult to see this chapel on Google Maps because of the trees, but when you go up to look at the satellite view, you can see it quite clearly, and it's quite an impressive addition to the church. The people that sat in that little wooden frame church on the corner of Grand River and Huron Avenue couldn't possibly imagine what the church of today would be. But if they could, I think they'd be very pleased. Join me in our next video and we'll mosey down 6th Street and see what else there is to see.